What about the inflation front here? I mean, endless amounts of money, money supply just growing by leaps and bounds. Right now, the market doesn't seem to be worried about it. What are your forecasts for inflation in 2021?
Well, I take a little disagreement that the market's not worried about inflation. We have seen the TIPS, the Treasury inflation protected securities, get back to a 2% break even, which is not really worried about inflation, but they were down well below 2%, so they've come back. We've seen the 10-year yield on treasuries go above 1% in a pretty decisive way. So, there's a little bit of a sense that things are changing, but I wouldn't call those, you're right, they're not really worried about inflation yet, but they're just seeing a little bit of change. Well, the other thing you mentioned is that there's a lot of money floating around. Let's be very specific about this. There's money as you measure it by M1 or M2. There's money in terms of if you measure the Fed's balance sheet or excess reserves of the banking system. But this is not the kind of money that buys goods and services. People buy goods and services with their credit cards. They move money from their investment accounts. They can click on their smartphones. The measures that we have of the Fed balance sheet and of the money supply haven't had any correlation with inflation for 25 or more years. So they are absolutely not an indicator of goods and service inflation. They are an indicator of asset price inflation, which we have had since the Fed has been more active. So, the question of whether we're going to get goods and service inflation is still quite up in the air. If you go kind of back to Economics 101, to get goods and service inflation, you have to have a lot more demand for goods and services than you have supply. And the money supply and the Fed don't create that kind of demand. It's generally, if it's going to happen, it's probably going to come from fiscal policy. And it has to be demand for things that otherwise wouldn't be bought. Infrastructure, or maybe providing money to state and local governments who would then spend the money on things that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So those kind of things have the potential to add up and eventually create some inflation. But so far, we haven't seen it. One last thought on this inflation thing. If you go back 400 years or so, and you look at when we've had inflation periods around the world, they're almost all associated with war. And the reason they are is because governments use a lot of debt to buy a lot of military equipment, goods and services for fighting the war, and that creates the inflation. And when the war's over, the inflation goes away. And the only possible exception to that recently was the 1970s. But in the 60s, we had the Vietnam War, and in the U.S., the Great Society program. So we did have fiscal policy being extremely expansive. So, I'm coming across not as a monetarist here. I do believe that money is important for inflation, but the Federal Reserve doesn't have the ability to create inflation on its own anymore.